Hi everybody, good to see you again. Today we're going to continue working with parallelograms. We're going to do a little problem solving. So we're really just going to try to solidify those properties and how they're useful. So first, yesterday we talked about how a parallelogram has 5 properties that belong just to the parallelogram. We know that a parallelogram is a quadrilateral. If you remember this guy from the other day, a parallelogram is a quadrilateral, so it has 4 sides. That also means that the interior angles will add to 360. But a parallelogram has 5 properties that belong specifically to a parallelogram. So not because it's a quadrilateral, but because it's a parallelogram. So the first one, the definition, is that opposite sides are parallel. So it has 2 pairs of parallel sides. Don't forget that's the symbol for parallel, and those are going to be our opposite sides that are parallel. Another property about the sides, so let me just put this in my picture really quick. Opposite sides are parallel. It's also going to have opposite sides not only parallel, but also congruent. So that means not only are they going to move at the same rate, they're going to be the exact same length. So opposite sides are congruent. We talked about 2 properties about angles. The first one was about opposite angles. Opposite angles, that's our angle symbol. That's a symbol for congruent. Opposite angles are also congruent. So these 2 guys will be congruent. You can see that both of those look like acute angles. Well, they're actually the exact same size acute angle. And both of these look like they are obtuse angles, and they're actually both the same size obtuse angles. So those are going to be congruent to each other. We also talked about consecutive interior angles. Those are the angles that are next to each other, like that, those ones that are consecutive. The consecutive interior angles are supplementary. Supplementary, that means they're going to add to 180 degrees. So I'm doing a lot of abbreviating here. Symbol for parallel, symbol for congruent, that means equal. Symbol for angle. This stands for consecutive interior angles are supplementary, and supplementary means they add to 180. And our last property was about our diagonals, and our diagonals bisect each other. And that means they're going to cut each other in half. So when I do draw my diagonals in, they actually cut each other in half. So these 2 halves would be congruent, and those 2 halves will be congruent. Now, they're not all congruent to each other, because in a parallelogram, you're going to have a long diagonal because 2 of your angles are pushed away from each other, and you're going to have a short diagonal because 2 of your angles are pushed closer to each other. So the diagonals aren't congruent, but they do cut each other in half. So what I'm going to ask you to do today is I'm going to ask you to pause the video a couple different times and try it on your own first, and then kind of just check in with the answer. So I've got 5 problems for us to do today. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at the picture. We're going to figure out which one of these 5 properties up here is going to help us. We're going to write that here on the line. Maybe there's more than one property that will help us. And then we're going to do any calculations and any algebra down here in this blank space. So we'll do this first one together, and then after that I'm going to ask you to do a lot of pausing today to kind of check in on your progress. So find the values of x and y in the parallelogram shown. So we know it's a parallelogram, so I'm going to go ahead and mark how I know it's a parallelogram. The opposite sides are parallel. So we're given a lot of information about sides. So the 2 properties that will help us will either be opposite sides are parallel or opposite sides are congruent. Now, knowing sides are parallel does not help us find a length, but congruent, because congruent also means equal, that can help us find a length. So the property we're going to use is opposite sides are congruent. And then I can also say equal, because that's going to mean equal. So if opposite sides are congruent, if opposite sides are equal, then what equation could we write? Or what equations? We actually might need 2 here. So pause the video, see what you come up with, So our first set is going to be 2x plus 10 equals 3x minus 5. So that's the top and the bottom, those opposite sides. But we also have left and right as opposite sides. So 8y equals 3y plus 20. So you can see here that I just kind of fast forwarded a little bit and did some of this work just so you can check yourself. So once we have those two equations, we're just going to use some algebra to solve them. So I subtracted 3x from both sides and subtracted 10 from both sides and ended up with x equals 15. And then over here I ended up with y equals 4. All right, let's take a look at it number 2. Find the values of x and y in the parallelogram shown. Then find the value of all 4 angles. So we want to make sure that we go back and do that after we found x and y. So looking at our picture, the information we're given this time is about angles. So let's look at our angle properties. So our angle properties are that opposite angles are congruent or consecutive angles are supplementary. So those are the two properties that could potentially help us here. So opposite angles congruent and consecutive interior angles supplementary. So remember that means they're going to add to 180. All right, so take a second, check out this picture and see if you can come up with equations that might help us find x and y. So 20x minus 60 and 12x plus 12 are opposite angles. So 20x minus 60 equals 12x plus 12 because opposite angles are congruent. That will help us find x. Finding y, we're actually going to have to use our second property, consecutive interior angles are supplementary. 4y plus 12x plus 12 equals 180. So I added these two together. You could have also added these two together, 4y plus 20x minus 60. That's totally fine as well. But for this equation or for our secondary equation, 20x minus 60 plus 4y equals 180, we have to know what x is first so we can plug it in to find y. So again, pause the video, solve these both, and see if you can find x and y. So if you did your math correctly here, you should have ended up with x equals 9. And then I showed a little bit of the work. I actually plugged x into my second equation. So 20 times 9 minus 60 plus 4y equals 180. And then I went ahead and solved that and got y equals 15. Now, if all it asked us to do was to find x and y, we'd stop here, but it asked us to find the value of all 4 angles. So how big is each angle measurement? So we're just going to go ahead and plug these back in. Now, I have a couple options here. I can just plug x into x and y into y and solve them, but just a couple things we can do. If I plug y in here, 4y, so that's going to be 4 times 15. This angle will be 60 degrees, so its opposite angle will be 60 degrees. Now we can go ahead and plug 9 in as well, but if we remember that consecutive interior angles are supplementary, that means this angle right here and this angle right here have to add to 180. So this is just going to be 180 minus 60. So these two angles then would both be 120 degrees. All right, let's take a look at example 3. Example 3, it doesn't tell us it's a parallelogram. So do we know this is a parallelogram? Well, if you notice, we've got these triangles in the middle of the side lengths. That is the arrow symbols that we wrote in up here. So we know this is a parallelogram because opposite sides are parallel. Now this time we don't have sides or angles, we actually have pieces of the diagonals. So we only have one property about diagonals. It's the diagonals bisect each other. Diagonals bisect each other. That means they cut each other in half. So this half and this half will be the same size. UT will equal TS. We also know this half and this half will be the same size. So XT will be equal to TV. So go ahead again, pause the video, see if you can write your equations and solve for x and y. So this is what I came up with for my two equations. So I really just after I wrote my equations with my segments, I just plugged in what I knew. So xt was 4x plus 1, tv was 10x minus 5. Same thing over here, ut was 6y minus 8 equals 3y plus 4. After I take a second to solve that, I got x equals 1 and y equals 4. Now for this problem, we were only asked to find x and y, so we can stop here. But if I asked you to find xv, then you could just plug in x. So 4 times 1 plus 1 is 5. Since this half is the same as that half, the whole thing would have to be 10. And since y was equal to 4, 26 times 4, 24 minus 8, or we could plug it in here, 3 times 4 plus 4, so we've got 12 plus 4, so 16. Since this half is the same as that half, then the whole thing would be 32. All right, just 2 more problems to do. Find the value of x and y in the parallelogram shown. Now this one's a little different than any of them we've done because we don't have sides, we don't have both diagonals, and we don't really have full angles, so we're going to have to do a little thinking on this one. All right, so we have a couple options here. Do you see this one diagonal that's drawn in has created 2 triangles? Well, don't we know that there is 180 degrees in a full triangle? So we could actually add these 3 together and set them equal to 180 degrees and find y. All right, so let's tackle that. So if we do 67 plus 38 plus y, that should equal 180 degrees because it makes a triangle, right? So all we need to do is figure out what y equals. So 67 plus 38 is 105. So y equals 75 degrees. All right. So what can we do now to find x? Well, this angle 67 and this angle right here are consecutive interior, and consecutive interior angles are supplementary, which means they add to 180. So if I added together 67 plus 38 plus x, it should also equal 180 degrees, which means 105 plus x equals 180, so x also equals 75 degrees. Now that's really interesting because x and y then are congruent to each other. Why would that be the case? Well, if this is a parallelogram, we've got these opposite sides parallel, and our diagonal is acting as our transversal. And if you remember, these kind of angles right here are called alternate interior angles, which makes them congruent, so x and y should end up being the same size. All right, our last problem here, example 5. Again, we have parallelogram because it's marked with our opposite sides parallel. We know this time that xt, which is just this little section, is 6 minus 3x. And we know that xv, oh, that's the whole thing, is equal to 14x plus 2. We want to find the value of x and tv. All right, what are we going to do here? So go ahead, look at your properties, pause the video, and see if you can come up with any strategies. So we do know that the diagonals bisect each other, which means they cut each other in half, and xt and tv are parts of diagonals, so we might want to try to use that. Diagonals bisect each other. So that means our shorter diagonal, SU, is cutting this guy in half. So that means XT is equal to TV, right? But if you remember from way back in first semester last year, segment addition, xt plus tv, xt plus tv should equal the whole thing, which is xv. So if we look at what we have right now, we know xv is 14x plus 2, and we know xt is 6 minus 3x. The only thing we don't know is tv. But if tv and xt are the same size, because they're congruent, wouldn't that also be 6x minus 3? Sorry, 6 minus 3x. And now we have an equation with one variable, so we can just go ahead and solve it. Feel free to pause and solve it. Alright, so I went ahead and solved it. I just added my like terms together for this step, and then I subtracted 14x and subtracted 12x, got negative 20x equals negative 10. So x equals 1/2. Alright, so let's look at what we were asked to do. Find the values of x, done. So x is equal to 1/2. And now we just need to find the value of tv. So tv, remember we've already marked it as 6 minus 3x because it was congruent to xt, because those diagonals bisect each other. So for tv, it's going to be 6 minus 3 times 1/2. So 6 minus 1.5. tv equals 4.5. And then this is a length, so we're going to put units on it. But since it doesn't give us units like inches or centimeters, we just call it units, so UN. So tv equals 4.5 units. All right, hopefully you were able to do some of these ahead of me or without me. But if you have questions after you look at the homework or after you looked at the notes, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.